Like we know that learning enhances the structure of our brain. That's how it works. I did studies many years ago showing that in rats that if you train them on this little task, they make more spines, little structures on their neurons. So you say, well, who cares? A few little spines here and there. Well, they add up. And we have like trillions of these things in our brain. And so the more you learn, the more of these spines that you generate, but you have to keep using them. They don't just appear and then just stay there. You have to kind of keep exciting them, keep engaging them. For example, after every map training class, I have everybody just sit there for like 30 seconds. Like close your eyes and then just feel how it feels. Like feel yourself, feel how you feel, and remember how you felt before class and compare it to how you feel now. And, that I think is the brain training, because then you're telling your brain, you're feeding them this information like, yeah, that's how I feel now. So next time when you're not feeling so good, or you don't want to do it, or you'd rather just sit on the couch, you'll do it.
Welcome to the Performance Initiative Podcast.
Our goal is to provide you and ourselves with the tools to be the best versions of ourselves.
We are your hosts, Dr. Grant Cooper
and Dr. Zinovy Meyler. We just wrapped up a conversation with Dr. Tracey Shors, and in this conversation we talked about a number of different topics, including, can you train yourself to become more resilient from psychological trauma?
Can an MRI tell the difference between the brain of a male and a female in utero?
We even talked about were Spartans correct in nurturing their young before sending them off to harsh training?
And we ask questions like, what can you do after a trauma so that you don't keep reliving that trauma in your brain months or even years later? And there is just no one better to talk to you about this than Professor Tracey Shors. Now, Professor Tracey Shors is a distinguished professor in behavioral and systems neuroscience in the Department of Psychology and the Center for Collaborative Neuroscience at Rutgers University. She has over 150 scientific publications, and she has recently written the very popular and excellent book, Everyday Trauma, which is just full of wisdom and, importantly, it's about practical wisdom that we can all use in our everyday life.
And specific training to become more resilient, which is really, really unique to talking about trauma.
Absolutely. Enjoy. Tracey, welcome to the show. We really enjoyed reading your book. And you start the book, Everyday Trauma, saying that we all have stories. And so we wanted to ask, why is it that two people can go through the same experience? Like it could be a car accident or the death of a loved one. And for one person, it'll be a scary or a sad event. But for the other person, it's a life-changing trauma and that they're still reliving, instead it's still harming their life 20, 30 years later.
Yeah. It's all attributed usually to individual differences. That's what that kind of phenomena is called. Like everyone is an individual and we're different from each other, depending on our genetic composition, how we were treated as a child, our history, what's happened to us. So everybody responds to the same event somewhat differently. Yeah, and that's, it's an interesting topic. In many studies, times people tend to group people like, how does everyone respond to this event? And then we study that and how do we intervene to make them better or whatever. But we know, right, if you really look into the data, that some people are not affected by stressors to the extent that someone else is. And so, that's you probably know, being in medicine, like that's the precision medicine idea, is that if you could tailor, an intervention to each person, that would be an ideal situation, because everyone's not going to respond to the same intervention in the same way that not everyone responds to the same event similarly.
Are there some characteristics that make people more likely to respond in one way or the other that we know about? I mean, presumably there are, but have we identified those?
Yeah, well, one of them that I talk about quite extensively in the book is just being a woman. Women are much more likely to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. They're much more likely to have depression, anxiety disorders, obviously eating disorders. So just being a woman in and of itself makes some people vulnerable, makes some of us vulnerable. history matters. People who have had a lot of trauma in childhood can be more susceptible to trauma as adults. Not necessarily. There's some people that are supposedly resilient because they went through a lot of trauma. So I don't think there's any one particular characteristic. It's a combination of many things, that make someone really suffer from a traumatic event.
And it's interesting. You've mentioned we've heard one of your interviews, and I think you mentioned it in the book, the fact that studying women's brains is sort of a new phenomenon in the scope of things, because previously it was always male brains that were studied, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's not super, depends on what you mean by new. But certainly in the last decade, I would say, things have changed considerably. Like when I first started getting interested in sex differences in the brain, that was in the 1990s. And in the 90s, no one was really that invested in looking at female brains. In laboratories, in scientific laboratories, almost all the studies were done in male rats or male mice or other male laboratory animals. In clinical trials, it was often, there was a preference for men because they didn't want to inadvertently, do something to women in case they were pregnant. Mm-hmm. That could hurt the fetus. So there was a bias definitely towards men, even in clinical trials. And that has changed over the last decade. Now, actually, if you have a grant from the National Institute of Health, in particular National Institute of Mental Health, you have to study both sexes, unless you have a good reason not to.
I thought that the story you told in the book about, I forget the details, they were looking at, I think it was something that was particularly about women, but they were using male rats.
Oh, yeah.
You remember that?
Yeah, I remember.
Can you tell that story? Because I thought it was such a surprise. But then when you explain why, you sort of understand how they got to that point. But it's still,
yeah, it was pretty insane, actually. I was at a meeting at UC Irvine. This was probably in the 80s, late 80s. And there had been a study showing that if you put estrogen into the hippocampus, which is a part of the brain we use for memory, it would change the way the cells in that part of the brain fired. So it was a pretty interesting finding at the time. And I remember asking a question. I said, did you do that in overrectomized females? Meaning, did you take out the ovaries, which produced estrogen, and they were like, oh no, we did it in males. I was like, why? And they were like, well, because, that's what we do. We only study, we just use males because that's what we have.
Right. And they use that example of, well, we don't have to worry about the
oh, yeah,
fluctuating, but
yeah,
it's very surprising.
Which is very interesting too, because they were like, well, we don't want to worry about the estrous cycle, which is like a menstrual cycle in rats. But what it turns out, the menstrual cycle is really interesting. We studied it a lot. I did years ago, and now there's quite a lot of studies in humans showing that the size of the hippocampus can even change across the menstrual cycle because it has this pretty large effect on the anatomy of that structure. And that was, first studied in rats.
And it's
so the menstrual cycle it is variable. It does cause a lot of changes, obviously.
No.
But it's important to understand it.
Yeah.
And if you're looking at estrogen, the way it would act on any structure, you would expect it to be by receptors. And as we know throughout the body for anything else, receptors are up and down regulated. So if you're studying male brains, you would expect them to have less receptor for estrogen. So if you studied female brain, they probably would have a different receptor, receptor population and response. So,
exactly.
Yeah. Big difference.
Big difference. I mean, in fact, if anything, I would say, when I was first studying this years ago, there weren't that many people really looking at it. It was almost like a sideshow. People were moderately interested, but not, super invested in it. And now there's almost too many differences reported. You can't keep up with it. Like there's not just one or two people doing it. There's, everyone's doing it now because they pretty much have to.
Yeah.
And so now there's like, so many findings you can't even keep up.
Coming back to the trauma idea, are there features of an experience that are more or less likely to make a traumatic event become a real trauma as opposed to a stressor that you can move past?
Well, probably the biggest feature is fear. Inducing a fear of death. Sometimes people call it horror. But if you feel like your safety or those that you love is in danger, that's, kind of like a threshold. That's like a critical variable. Because things can be obviously very stressful, but you don't necessarily maybe feel like you're going to die or going to have irreparable damage. And I think that's kind of a key feature of most trauma for people.
Yeah. It seems to us also that if you had a sense of purpose associated with the trauma, like you're trying to, the example that we came up with in our heads was,
well, two things. And I think in our conversation, the way we started thinking about this is that we deal with pain, right? We deal with people in pain, and it's very surprising how some people will suffer with their pain and others will certainly experience pain, and it'll be a significant factor in their lives, but it won't be necessarily suffering, if you know what I mean. So, so to us, we started thinking, and there are two features, right? There are two features that seem to be present. One is lack of purpose for the pain, and the other one is lack of agency, right? And so sort of hopelessness. And so that got us to the example.
Right, the example of like if you're a Navy SEAL, or an aspiring Navy SEAL going through buds and you're freezing in the water, but you're there because you want to be a Navy SEAL, that's one kind of a traumatic event in a way. And if you fall off an ocean liner in Alaska, and you're bobbing up and down in the freezing ocean, that's they're both freezing, but one is doing it of their own volition and with a purpose, and the other, and so
not helpless, full
not
of
helpless, right.
Yeah.
So
is that something
does that pan out in the way that we think about trauma in terms of, or is that not?
Yeah, certainly the controllability aspect is really important. So if you feel like you have control over the stressor, or you can actually kind of predict what's going to happen, that lessens the impact for sure. It's when people feel a lack of control, like you said, hopeless. They're hopeless. They're like, oh, it's never going to get better. I don't think I'll ever be able to, walk again or do whatever I used to do again. And this is the pain is like a representation of that.
Right.
Then I think it falls into the trauma category. Whereas people think, well, maybe if I do X, Y, and Z, I will get better. Or I know of other people who got better, then that, lessens it, even though the pain might be similar.
Right, you drive that agency back.
Yeah, the idea of agency is from this story that I remember hearing about Pearl Harbor, and I couldn't find it. So I think it's somebody extrapolated a story from a real event where some sailors had no guns, nothing to fire back at the Japanese bombers and kamikaze. So they took potatoes and they started throwing potatoes at the submarines and at the planes. And those that actually threw them didn't have as much trauma afterwards, just because they were doing something.
Although you could say that the people that were more likely to pick up the potatoes were just less likely to be people that are prone to
they were able to do something in the event. Because I did talk about in my book that situation where the couple was in the car crash together, and the man was able to like break the window and jump out and help his wife escape, and the wife was just frozen. Classic case of someone who freezes and then someone else is able to fight and do the fight or flight response.
Yeah, and then later they have a much different response as well.
Yeah.
Like the woman ends up being much more traumatized.
Yeah.
And then the one thing that I think we both liked and I absolutely loved about your book is that you give specific tools, which we'll get to, and a way to actually deal with things as opposed to just exploring trauma. And I guess what we're trying to get to with this idea is, does it make sense that if you're going through an event that is potentially traumatic, try to make a plan, try to see what you can do, even if it's not going to change the outcome, of the actual event currently, but does coming up with a plan put you in a better position to be more, to have agency over the event and potentially less likely to have trauma linger?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, that's kind of one of the things I tried to get across, particularly towards the end of the book, is like, it's all about, also about prevention. You can set yourself up to be prepared for trauma, because we're all going to have trauma. Like, something bad is going to happen. People we love are going to die. We're eventually going to die. It's not as if, oh, that thing that happened, last year, that's it, I'm done with trauma, it's not going to happen again. I mean, it's just not true.
It doesn't work
And
that way?
it doesn't work that way. But we tend to think that it does. Like, oh, well, we'll just deal with that past trauma. We don't appreciate that it's going to happen in the future. And yeah, we have some pretty good data actually suggesting that people who kind of, like you say, prepare, they're kind of preparing for trauma, at least by learning new skills and learning new ways of dealing with it when it happens. Yeah, they do much better.
All right. And the MAP training, which we'll get to in a little bit, is a phenomenal way, I feel like, to prepare, because basically you're preparing your body and your mind to be more resilient to anything. It seems to me that another way, just as we're talking, another way that might be helpful is after a trauma to, when you think of the trauma, to try to think of it. Maybe this is what cognitive behavioral therapy does. Try to look at the benefits. I mean, it's hard to say that because trauma is trauma, but if you can extrapolate something good from it, at least you can derive some purpose from it. Even if it's only, look, I'm going to have another trauma in life, and having gone through one, it'll, now at least I know what that feels like, and I'll be more prepared for the next one.
Because if you think about it, sometimes people say, well, why would you remember something really horrible that happened? Because it interferes with your life and you can't quit thinking about it. But it has value. And the value is that then you learn from that experience. At a very basic level, you learn like, hey, I'm not going to get in that car again, or go down that street again, or hang out in that alleyway. So you learn kind of basic reactions or things to not do. But then you can generalize that. You generalize that knowledge, something that happened in the trauma, to other experiences in your life. I talked about this experience that I had where this man broke into a house I was living in when I lived in Hollywood Hills in graduate school. And, I'm sure he had bad intentions. And I hid throughout the night because he broke down a door, and I assumed he was looking for me. I was never attacked. I was never assaulted or anything. I really barely saw him, but it had a big impact on my life. And, so not only was I afraid of that house, and which I'd never slept in that house again, but then, for years and even up to this day, I was very conscientious about, where I live and having a security system. And so you learn from these experiences, and then hopefully if they don't just devastate you, you take this information, and then it makes you safer in the future.
Friends, we hope you're finding value in the content. If you're enjoying what you're watching, please consider hitting the like button, help us with our YouTube algorithm, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on the notification button to stay up to date with everything going on in the channel. I mean, it's a little bit like having kids, where you want them to have a big enough trauma for them to learn from it. Trauma is probably the wrong word, but you want them to fall and scrape their knee so they learn to be more careful so they don't break a bone, right? Ideally, that's how that would,
Yeah, and that's why the brain is set up like that. Through eons of evolution, that's why we have this system. So, it's not there to make us unhappy or suffer. It's there to help us learn.
Yeah.
It's an inoculation, right? Inoculation is sort of the way the immune system works, by learning and then preparing.
Yeah.
In a similar way, certain traumatic events, whether it's physical or psychological, create that immune response, if you will.
Yeah.
Speaking of brains and the science of these things, could you describe the neuroscience that goes behind what happens when someone undergoes a stress?
Yeah. I talk about two systems. Everyday trauma is the title of my book, and I talk about two types of everyday trauma. So there's one type would be a really bad experience, like what happened to me in that a house in the Hollywood Hills, or someone who was raped, or in an earthquake, or, some kind of discrete event. And the event itself is really frightening, and you'll have a lot of fear. And that response is called is kind of mediated by the autonomic nervous system. And in particular, I think most people have heard of the fight or flight response. So it's the so-called fight or flight response. You release lots of epinephrine and norepinephrine, from your adrenal glands. Your brain responds with lots of neurotransmitters, and that instigates like a really fast response in the brain. Heart is beating fast, lots of, blood goes to the brain, oxygen to all your organs. So you can fight or flight or potentially freeze if that's, a good response. And that response, like I said, is quick. It should go down as soon as the event is over, or soon after the event is over. But it still has massive changes in the brain. It changes the anatomical structures in the brain. It changes, neurotransmitters, obviously hormonal changes. And so that response kind of sets up another response. The other response would be the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis response, also called the HPA response. And most people know that as the stress response. The stress response is just releasing cortisol, the hormone cortisol, from your adrenals into your blood. And that's a little bit like a persistent response, because cortisol is, as you I'm sure know, is anti-inflammatory. So if you have injury or some damage to your nervous system or your body, you want to release some cortisol. So that response is more persistent. And, those two systems interact to some extent, but they are separate. But, you need to have the first one really to have a traumatic experience. But then it's usually comes along with this cortisol response. And for people that have a lot of trauma, it's hard to know for sure because there's a lot of variability, but at least some people with trauma, those responses don't come back to homeostasis. Because all of us, we have these systems that activate and then they go back to homeostasis. That's how it works. But they become like hyperactive. So they still are releasing, maybe norepinephrine. They have a trigger, like they have a memory, and that response comes back again. That sympathetic nervous system, heart races.
And that's true even if there's no further trauma. That's just, they're just at a heightened state that just stays.
That could be, the first one, the norepinephrine response with the sympathetic nervous system, usually is triggered. Like someone sees somebody that reminds them of something that really bad happened, and then they get that response. Mm-hmm. For the second one, the cortisol response, that could be just persistent. And, I think I talked a little bit about the people who migrate, long distances from one country to another. Yes. That's a persistent kind of cortisol response. And that also has long-lasting consequences on the brain, on the anatomy of the brain.
Yeah. And in those folks, I think that the study was that once they got citizenship, is that right? Or once they had legal status, their cortisol levels came back down.
Yeah.
But the ones that didn't, they were still elevated.
They were still elevated.
Prove the point, I guess.
Yeah. And those responses are like, I think some of these people, they're just hormones, but hormones are powerful. Hormones are meant to, I don't know if they're meant for something, but they do change the structure of organs. That's how they work. And so if you're continually releasing these hormones, it's going to obviously change the structure of your brain.
Are there advantages to having those changes with the cortisol response?
Well, you want some. You want a little cortisol because, again, it's anti-inflammatory. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of a moderate. You want to have some, but you just don't want to have it persisting. Day after day after day. And then it's not so good.
Right. It struck me with the acute response. In men, in particular, it helped them with their memory. Is that right? Did I get that right? Whereas in women, it didn't?
Yeah, there are a few studies suggesting that it's better, works a little differently in men versus women. I always hate to say better or worse, but just differently.
Well, it improved their memory. It improved, I forget what the study was, but it improved their memory recall.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it made me think that when you're studying for an exam, you should put your hand in ice water. If you really want to learn it.
Yeah.
Not for too long, kids.
Yeah, a little stress is good for performance. I mean, that idea has been studied a lot over the years, and there's all these hypotheses and theories about it. But again, there's so many individual differences. So, some people don't respond terribly well to stressors before they have to take a test or something.
Right.
Yeah.
So maybe not the ice water then for everybody.
No, maybe not. Yeah, it's better to do things that are more kind of consistent with what you're trying to learn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Something that we're always trying to. There seems to be this tension of, on the one hand, you go through these traumas, especially as a child, and it seems to set you up for being more vulnerable to traumatic events and responding suboptimally in the future. And on the other hand, there is this idea that it builds resilience. And I mean, they've, in wars, the soldiers that have had more difficult upbringings seem to thrive better, from what I can gather from talking to people and from the books that I've read about it. How do we parse that, in terms of the neuroscience and just what we see clinically?
I don't think we know, to be perfectly honest. There's been so many studies on this, and there's this, the Resilience Project, and there's really large, big studies with lots of funding to study that. And I don't think we really know. I mean, again, there's people that have a lot of trauma and they really never get over it, and they're really vulnerable to other traumas going forward. And there's other people that have a lot of trauma and they're fine. Not fine, but, they're certainly so-called resilient. I didn't know. I don't think there's an easy formula. If there was, if I had discovered it, I would probably have the Nobel Prize.
Hey, it's not too late.
But I don't think there's any one thing. And in part, I think, even the systems I just told you kind of tell you that. They're so complicated and complex, and they interact with one another. And that's not even mentioning the genetic predispositions you might have. There's trauma that you even inherit through generations. I talk a little bit about that also in the book. They're a little hard to study, obviously, particularly in humans.
Yeah.
We don't
live.
live.
Right, but actually, it's a really interesting. I mean, back in the 90s, that would have been unthinkable, right? The idea that you would transmit this trauma down from generation to generation. Can you describe how that happens? That's a really interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's it actually kind of began this whole field of so-called epigenetics. Epigenetics, which is how genetic information kind of gets transferred through our environmental experience gets transferred through our genes, and by changing the messenger RNA. Now, one of the ways it was initially kind of discovered, I guess you could say, was through rat studies, where they looked at rats who had offspring, and offspring who were either taken care of by their mothers or not taken very well taken care of by their mothers, grew up to have a different stress response. Mm-hmm. And then they produced offspring that had a different stress response. And, so there was all this ideas well, how could that be? How could you inherit this trauma response? And so, I mean, this is not my field of expertise, but, certainly there's a lot of evidence to suggest it does it through these so-called epigenetic changes, changes at the level of the messenger RNA. And the studies in humans, as I mentioned, are really hard to do because they're all retrospective. But they were able to look at people who went through the potato famine, and then able to show that the offspring of those people had a different stress response than people who weren't in the famine.
The idea of a well taken care of baby that then becomes more resilient and has a better stress response, more adaptable stress response is really interesting. And we were talking about the idea of kind of the wisdom of the ages and thinking of the history of Spartans, right? These resilient warriors that gave away their children to the school of war, essentially. But they didn't do that until 7 years old. So until 7, they were children. Until 7, they stayed at home and they played and they had pets and toys and so on and so forth, and they felt safe until the age of 7. and then they were exposed to these inoculations of stressors and
Wow.
That seemed to be a somewhat ideal balance. And when we were thinking about it, that you have this nurturing environment to a point, and then the Spartan.
Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, because some of the studies in rats too, suggested that it was the touching too. It wasn't just, getting the milk or keeping them warm. It was the touching that really helped develop this stress response that we all use, the so-called, the HPA axis, the cortisol response. That response is dependent to some extent on how well you are nurtured as a infant.
Right.
And that response, that's really an intrinsic response, because, and I know we didn't get to that line of questions that we wanted to get to, where can you use pharmacology to affect the stress response? But it seems that some people have tried giving cortisol to exogenous, essentially glucocorticoids, and that didn't really have a great response. So even though we understand that axis, but trying to influence it with exogenous medication didn't really have the same response as.
But it did in the ICU. Like there was a study, there was a study, I think, in the ICU where by giving glucocorticoids for this group of patients, but they might have been depleted.
Right.
Yeah, okay,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
But so maybe it's just by getting them back to normal.
Right.
Ah,
Right.
okay, yeah, that's
Yeah.
your point.
And
They have
acutely.
less PTSD. And acutely.
Yeah, and acutely. Because I think it's, one thing to give something acutely, you might see something, but once you start giving something like corticosteroids chronically, all kinds of things go
Right, that
awry.
would be very
Yeah.
problematic.
Yeah.
But I think the studies you're talking about were acute, right? They tried to
They
get
were,
acute.
yes, they were acute, and they were trying to really as a prevention for PTSD, and it
Yeah.
didn't seem to have a significant, statistically significant response.
Yeah, they tried similarly
Yeah.
with beta blockers, right?
Yeah.
And that didn't do it either. Yeah.
I think we want, our tendency is to want to find like one thing, one molecule or one brain region or one thing that answers all these questions, or you could use as a therapy. And it's just not one thing.
But that is the Nobel Prize.
Nobel Prize. Because the brain is so complex and it's so dynamic. I think that's the key that we miss. I always tell my students, I try to tell them to think about the brain, the parts of the brain, or even the components of the brain as verbs and not nouns. Because we think of, there's fear, or there's anxiety, or there's, the hippocampus, or there's neurons, and those are all nouns. And so it makes us think that there's one thing that we can like extract and either understand it or treat it or whatever. But it's not like that. It's so dynamic. Everything is changing. Anything that you were to look at in this moment, 5 seconds from now is different in your brain. Because those neurons are all firing differently. They're changing, they're connecting. Even what we're talking about now is changing a lot of different things in our brain. And so those are processes, those are verbs. They're active. They're not things. They're not nouns.
Yeah, I like that. But you still think of the hippocampus as a noun.
Well, I do,
Hippocampus something.
Intellectually, yes. But it doesn't sit there separate from everything else. It's connected to everything. And so we just put this arbitrary kind of like, there's the hippocampus and there's the amygdala. But in reality, they're all communicating with one another as we speak.
And being changed by that communication in real time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was actually thinking just before we got on, there's a study that came out recently about sex differences. And there's some sex differences, in the brain, the anatomy of the brain, obviously. But this study, they looked at the fetus of women who were pregnant. They put these women through a scanner, and they scanned the fetus, and they were able to find different networks in the little infants, fetuses, that were male versus female. So much so that they could predict the sex just based on the neuronal networks that were active alone.
Wow.
So
Patients.
yeah, that's pretty interesting, right? And so that means like not only are you the anatomy might be different, the structures like the hippocampus or the amygdala or what's in them, but the way that they're interacting with one another is different.
Right.
even as early as in utero.
Yeah. Somehow it's not surprising that that's the case. It's surprising to me that we can see that, right?
Yeah.
That the advance
Yeah.
of the technology to be able to pick that up.
Yeah, exactly. Like you kind of knew that, but
Right.
wow, that you could
Right.
figure that out and actually prove it is cool.
Yeah. 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 Wow. Um,
I
well, go ahead.
no. This is I wanted to move on.
Move to rumination.
Yeah.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
No, that was
Rumination.
really interesting the way you describe it.
Yeah. Could you talk about rumination and why that's so important and what we should?
Yeah, rumination, the bane of our existence.
I've been ruminating about this all.
I know, I spent a lot of time ruminating about it. Yeah, so ruminations are memories. They're a form of memory because you have them over and over again. They're repetitive thoughts. So by definition, they are a form of memory. They're always autobiographical. So that means they're always about yourself in some way. They're usually negative, not necessarily. I mean, you could ruminate about something positive, but most people don't. Most of them are kind of negative, and they're also usually filled with a little bit of blame or regret. I think of them as memories laced with mood. So they're kind of a memory, but they have this mood attached to them. And they're really bad for us. They keep you from being present now, because if you're always thinking about something that happened in the past, going over it and over it, you can't be present. They're highly associated with depression, anxiety, trauma thoughts, so they come packaged with all these other thoughts that we have that are usually negative. And, one of the things that I talk about quite a bit in the book is that they also create more memories. So if you bring back a negative image or feeling and kind of story from your past and into this moment, so you think, oh, this bad thing that happened, and then I start thinking about it right now, I basically make another memory, right? Because I've taken that memory and updated it with this present moment. And so now you have another memory. And so ruminations are really just kind of memory creators. And if you think about memories more as anatomical substances or, that have traces in your brain, you can imagine if you're ruminating a lot, you're just creating more and more and more of these traces.
And what we know about memory, or at least the way we understand memory at this point, is that it's not like a videotape, right? It's moments that we remember, and then when we recall, there is to some extent some confabulation that's happening where we fill in the gaps. And it seems like when you ruminate and you add the mood and you add a different perspective to it, you can change the story completely. And the more you chip away at it, the more you go over and over and over. There's no such thing as an objective recollection, right? It becomes completely changed by the mood that you bring into it at the time that you're ruminating. And you mentioned there are three different types of rumination that you described, right?
Right.
So there's, I believe there's depressive, there's brooding, and then there's reflective. And reflective being the most functional of the three, but still not a good one, but more functional than the others, right?
Yes. The depressive and the brooding ones are definitely not good because they're associated with depression, brooding thoughts. It was my fault. I shouldn't have done that. If I'd only done this, then this wouldn't have happened. Those kind of like really deprecating kind of thoughts. Reflective are a little less moody. They're more just like you could think about something and kind of go over what happened over and over again. Like maybe you were in I don't say like a breakup, but maybe, or a car accident, and you just kind of trying to figure out what happened during the car accident. And you're like kind of go over the scene without necessarily feeling a lot about it. Yeah, and those are not nearly as bad as the depressive or the brooding ones. But they're all pretty bad. And we did some studies looking at how they correlate with other symptoms. And it's striking, really. We took a bunch of people and we asked them all these surveys about their anxiety, their depression, their trauma history, what they're thinking, feeling, etc. And the best predictor of all of those thoughts kind of together, we did a factor analysis of that, was rumination. So basically, how much people were ruminating accounted for the vast majority of the variance in all these other symptoms. Meaning it's almost like a proxy for mental health.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really like, by the way, what you said in the book about like thinking about rumination as sort of if you had a hard drive and you kept on opening windows, and
Yeah.
it gets so cluttered with all those windows that it starts slowing down. And that to me, that really brought it to
Yeah.
life in terms of how it can be so, how it can interfere so much with trying to learn something new or just, move on.
Right. And there's even studies to suggest that again, these networks that are, that we can kind of look at now with human brain imaging are different. So when people are ruminating, they're using a kind of specific network. And in order to do something more functional or adaptive, like pay attention, do something new, learn something, that requires a shift, to another network. And it can be very hard to shift out of that rumination network because people almost get into ruminating. I'm a big ruminator, and I feel like to some extent I enjoy it almost, and in a weird way, in a very maladaptive way. And
Yeah.
I think learning more about it helps you like not go down that road. Just like see like, oh wow, I am ruminating again, and I don't need to. I have already thought about this a lot. I don't need to think about it again.
I think that there's an element of you start to, especially if it's a pattern that's been there for a long time, not you, all of us start
Yeah.
to identify with that pattern.
Yeah.
And then there's a comfort in the misery of it, in a sense. Right?
Exactly.
Then you gravitate towards that because it's something you know. But once you
Yeah.
can extricate yourself from it, you can actually leave it behind if you can get to that extrication. So what can we do about rumination? How do we break that cycle?
I mean, some of the obvious ways are through therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. There's a lot of, variations that try to target rumination. I somewhat came upon it by accident, and to some extent, I was developing. Should we talk about map training now?
Yeah,
Maybe?
why don't we?
Let's do it.
That's a
Great
good
segue.
good segue, yeah.
Because that's a big part of it. So,
Yeah.
I developed this intervention known as MAP training. It stands for mental and physical. And the mental training is 30 minutes of meditation, silent meditation, followed by 30 minutes of aerobic exercise. And I developed it in part based on some work I had done on neurogenesis, showing that new neurons in the brain are kept alive by mental training, and more of them are made through aerobic exercise. So the idea came from kind of laboratory science work that I was doing to some extent at Princeton and at Rutgers. But doing these kind of studies, these intervention studies in people is kind of a different story. You can't go in there and look at their neurons and see how many they've made, or that just is out of the question. So, we obviously ask people questions like, how do you feel after doing this intervention? Do you feel better? Do you, less anxious? All these kind of surveys. And so one of the ones that we did, like right off the bat, in one of our first studies was a rumination scale. A colleague of mine had suggested that we use it. So I didn't really a priori necessarily come upon, think, oh, I should look at rumination. But what we did find is like every single study, yeah, people said they ruminated a lot less after this training. So they would do this procedure, this intervention like once or twice a week for 6 weeks. At the beginning, they were ruminating a lot. We did a lot of people with trauma, people with clinical depression, poverty, people with HIV. I mean, we did a lot of different populations. During COVID, we did, teachers with, during the COVID epidemic. And in every single case, after the intervention, they all said they ruminated less. And as a consequence, these other symptoms went down too, depression, anxiety, trauma-related thoughts, etc. So my feeling is that these rumination are really the key. And I have a brain imaging study going on right now to try to look at that. Like we had people ruminate in the scanner, before and after the the map training intervention. So
To see how it changes.
yeah.
Am I right also that there was something in the book, I didn't realize this was a finding, that the size of with people with depression, I think it was the size of the hippocampus was actually smaller. Is that right?
Yeah.
Is it something that we might be able to diagnose someday with like a wrap on sort of the diagnosis, for example, of depression is it's not something you can see. It's not something that we have any kind of objective measurement for. Is it possible that that's changing?
I'm actually going to write my new book on this very topic. Because I do feel like now that there is enough data to talk about it. I would say like when MRI and fMRI kind of first started coming out 10, 20 years ago, there was these spurious reports like, oh yeah, people that are, clinically depressed over many years have a smaller hippocampus. And I just kind of rolled my eyes like, I don't know. I don't know if I believe that. And there just wasn't enough data. But I think there's pretty good data now to suggest that that this does occur. Now, it doesn't occur in every person. So I don't think you could use it to diagnose.
But maybe to track. I mean, it would be really interesting if after the map training, if that changed, that would be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We're going to look at that, obviously. And
interesting is that it's a consequence, right? So you'd have to change the depression in order to increase the size of the hippocampus, not the other way around, or at least that's the thinking right now, right? If you were to find a way to stimulate the hippocampus to grow one way or another, would that change the depression? It doesn't seem that way, that the hippocampus really is a consequence.
It is a consequence. And again, it's part of this dynamic nature, because just having a bigger hippocampus just sitting there isn't going to do any good. But if it's active, connecting with other things because you're doing things. I mean, one of the things about depression in particular, but it also applies to people who have a lot of trauma, is that they're not necessarily using their brain as much as other people might be. And that, I think, is what ultimately leads to the decrease in volume.
Is that because of the rumination, you think? Because the brain is in this one track?
Yeah, it could be. That's part of it. And again, other things. And also, but as you know, people who are depressed, they're not socializing, they're not exercising, they're not engaging, they're probably not out there trying to go on vacation and meet new people, and all these things that also enhance the structure of our brain.
I love the quote in your book. That's the opposite of depression is not happiness, it's vitality.
Yeah, that's a great quote.
That's what you're describing now, right? That's
The having that energy and enthusiasm for life, that's what changes your brain. And the anatomy of a brain. That's how I feel about it. And that's why I feel like if you can inspire people to learn, like we know that learning enhances the structure of our brain. That's how it works. I did studies many years ago showing that in rats, that if you train them on this little task, they make more spines, little structures on their neurons. So you say, well, who cares? A few little spines here and there. Well, they add up. We have like trillions of these things in our brain. And so the more you learn, the more of these spines that you generate, but you have to keep using them. They don't just appear and then just stay there. Right. You have to kind of keep exciting them, keep engaging them. Yeah.
Right. They're perishable and they're use it or lose it. And our bodies in general are very efficient, and that they have to be fed.
Exactly.
And if you're not using them, then it's expenditure of energy that we don't need. And it was very interesting that in the book you mentioned that different exercises all promoted some degree of a response, but aerobic was the best. So it was, if I recall correctly, the weightlifting or resistance training wasn't as good as high intensity interval training, but none of them were quite as good as aerobic.
Exactly.
And that was studied in rats primarily?
Well, there's been a lot of studies on that, but the initial studies were done in rats and some in mice too, rodents for sure. Because again, you can't look at human brains while they're at the cellular level while they're
People frown
exercising.
upon that. Yes.
Yeah, not that Elon Musk figures out how to get
Yeah, exactly.
Well, one thing I was trying to figure out is how do you make a rat do high intensity interval training?
Yeah.
How did you do that?
Well, I didn't actually do it. This was on she used to be my postdoc actually, and she had some kind of regimen where they were just having them run on a wheel, and then they had to grab onto some kind of pole and hang down, and it was
Not to make them fear for their lives a little bit. I mean, to get them to be that high intensity, right? That's the whole point. They have to go above and beyond. It must,
And then rest completely.
and then rest completely. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
we're not going to get into the study design, but the combination of what you came up with map training is great because you're addressing it in so many different ways. Like mindfulness addresses novelty, right? Because if you're mindful, if you're meditating, both static as well as active meditation, you're increasing your presence, and that presence will increase your mindfulness, and that increases your experience of novelty, and which in itself is going to create more spines and create more.
yeah.
And one of the things that, once again, that we notice with people experiencing pain is that most people that are going to, for lack of a better word, panic about their pain, it's not because the intensity of the pain that they're experiencing in the moment. It's usually going to be, how is this going to be if I'm experiencing this much pain now, and if I extrapolate, I'm just going to die of the intensity of the pain. Because if I'm experiencing pain at a 3 and it just went to a 5 within a period of 30 seconds, then in the next 30 seconds probably goes to a 7 and then to a 10, and then that's it. And so that being able to be present takes away that experience towards the future and extrapolation and so on and so forth. So that presence from the first part of the map training is incredible, plus the added exercise element.
Yeah. No, I agree. That's a great way to think of it. It kind of forces you to be present.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you learn, because I talk a lot about how you're learning these skills. Sometimes people think of meditation as a form of like relaxation or attention. And I think of it as a form of learning, because you're learning the skill, how to be present now, how not to ruminate, how not to go in the past, how not to go in the future. That's hard. Because when you're meditating, you're trying to focus, on this moment. And then before you know it, you're thinking about, dinner and what someone said to you yesterday. And so that training while you're doing it, you can apply that then to other aspects of your life, when you don't want to necessarily be going into the past or into the future. So it's a skill that you develop during meditation that you can take to other moments.
And it seems to be that physiologically there are a number of different systems in our body even that have a similar mechanism in terms of extrapolating and looking into the future. To make a very simple analogy, most people are familiar. Well, I don't know. I think many people are familiar with arm wrestling and people just kind of giving up. And what we know is people don't give up. The body gives up, and there's a spindle apparatus in the tendon that looks at the stretch of the tendon, but it doesn't look at the stretch. It looks at how fast that stretch is happening. And essentially what it does, as far as we understand it, is that it extrapolates and says, well, if we are going to exert this much force through our own muscle over a period of time, we're going to tear the muscle or tear the tendon. So we better flip the switch and turn off the muscle, and then it shuts off the actual muscle. So it's a protective mechanism that extrapolates into the near future and protects us. So it seems to be physiologic, and there's a psychological advantage to some extent, but just like anything else, just like the axis that we were talking about, if it goes awry, and it just, everything is good in moderation, and the poison goes. Yeah.
Like kind of knowing when to give up to some extent. Yeah, when to let it go. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And I think, one of the things that we also did with the MAP training is because people often ask me, they say, well, of course meditation is good for you, and of course exercise is good for you. So, what's the big deal? Why do you put them together? Like, what's so great about that? And so we tested that. We had some people who only meditated twice a week. We had some people who only exercised twice a week. And then we had people who did neither. And we had people who did both. And the people who did both, were much better. They fared better. They had less depression. They had less trauma thoughts. They had less rumination. And I think the idea is that you learn these skills during the meditation, and then when you exercise right after, you bring all this blood to your brain, all this oxygen, and it kind of consolidates that learning. It really sets it in stone, so to speak. So I think that's that's why it's so powerful. And I see it in people. Like I see them before they start the training and right after, and it's amazing, how different people act within just an hour.
The one arm of that study that I wish that maybe in the future or something one could do is to not just do, so there's 3 arms basically, right? One was doing both. One's doing the meditation and one's doing the exercise. But to me, it would have been interesting also to do one arm where you do both, but you don't do them together. Right?
Yeah.
So, it's harder because you have to come back another time and stuff, but to see if that temporality is an important feature. My guess, and my guess that your guess is the same, is that it is important.
Yeah, I think it is important, but because I think people ask me that often. They say, well, I'll meditate at home, but then I go to the gym later.
Right.
So is that the same? And I'm like, I don't think it's the same.
Yeah.
And what I would say, and this is just my own kind of personal feeling about it, is that if you just meditate, even if it's 30 minutes or however long, you will feel more quiet. Your brain is settled down. There's less chatter. You're less anxious. But you don't necessarily, at least I don't necessarily have more energy. I feel better. I'm more relaxed, but I don't have necessarily more energy. If I only exercise, I have lots of energy afterwards and have lots of just more energy. But sometimes it's a little bordering on anxiety, it's a little bit too much energy. And I think the combination is it's like a nice kind of settled mental feeling with energy.
Yes. And specifically the meditation first, right? That's important.
Yeah. I haven't done the opposite, mostly because I don't think people would meditate. If you exercise first and then ask people to meditate, they'd be like, forget it. Because the meditation's the hard part.
Right.
Yeah.
But the way you described it in the book, I thought it was more planned out because it's you don't want to use the meditation to bring yourself down from the high of the exercise, right? You want the meditation to be there when you're just, in your natural state.
Yeah.
So that you get more out of it by doing it in that.
No, definitely. Yeah, that was another reason. The second was kind of practical, or what I mentioned was a practical reason. But yeah, I think it's best to meditate when you're in your normal state. Yeah. So if you're kind of stressed out or unhappy or having a lot of trauma thoughts, that's when you should meditate. Because if you do it after exercise, it's a different state.
Right.
You usually feel pretty good. And you want to meditate when you're not at your best, when you need it.
Prone to rumination, right? When
you're ruminating, and that's when you want to do it.
The meditation that you do in it, there's 2 parts to it, right? There's the first part where you have people sitting, and then there's the more active part. Why are those? Can you describe that, and why the 2 parts?
Yeah. So the first part is 20 minutes of sitting meditation. And it's not guided, it's complete silence, so it's hard to do. And by definition, I wanted it to be hard. People say, well, can I listen to music or lay down? Like, no. I mean, you could, but that's not mental training. You want to make it difficult. So you sit completely silent for 20 minutes, follow your breath, counting your breath. When your mind goes off, just bring it back to your breath and count again. 20 minutes. Then we do 10 minutes of very slow walking meditation, which is basically similar because it's also in silent. But now instead of focusing on your breath, you focus your attention in your feet. Yeah. And I don't know, I like slow walking meditation. You walk really slow and pay attention to your feet. When your mind starts to wander off into other ideas and thoughts, you think, oh, I'm not paying attention now. I was supposed to be paying attention to my feet, and you go back to your feet. And so again, it's a skill, you're like, oh, I'm not. So you learn to pay attention, you forget to pay attention, you remember that you forgot to pay attention, and you go back. And that skill is, again, it's just something that you train your brain to do so that you can use it anywhere. But walking imitation in particular is kind of nice because you go from sitting, now you're walking, and then we do the aerobic exercise.
Yeah.
So you kind of have a transition from being completely still, walking slowly, and now getting your heart rate up, pretty high.
This is probably a silly question. I asked Zinovy yesterday, and he told me it was a silly question because maybe it's obvious about the foot. So I went to do this, to do the meditation that way, but I hadn't thought about, I injured my toe playing with my son. And so doing it was sort of impossible for me because I can't put pressure right now on my big toe. Is there a good alternative? I mean, obviously, so the silliness is, I guess you could find anything that you can just focus in on and pay particular attention to the activity that you're doing. But is there a good alternative other than just waiting for your toe to feel better?
Well, yeah, I mean, because we have dealt with quite a few populations of people who had different physical, problems that they couldn't necessarily exercise even that well. So I don't think it really matters how you do it, as long as you're paying attention. So you could do it sitting in a chair.
Just to focus on whatever, some fine movement that goes slow, that you're
Yeah.
aware of all the
Yeah.
tactile and
Yeah. That's kind of a good question. I hadn't really thought about that, but yeah, I guess you could
there's
do it.
probably not too many people got their toe messed up by a.
Well, it would be hard to exercise after that too, huh?
Well, ironically, once I get going, so I can actually, it hurts a lot afterwards, but once you get the blood, probably as a doctor, my advice would be to let it rest and you hope there well. But for me, the reality is that if I start moving a lot, then enough endorphins go and I can.
Yeah.
It's not that bad, but if going slow on it is kind of miserable because it's like taking like a small cut and just slowly.
Yeah.
It's not, kind of takes you out of the moment.
I mean, what I would say just offhand is like, just sit for 30 minutes then.
Yeah. Okay.
Just sit for the 30 and then get up and do the exercise. Yeah.
And the aerobic, you have a very specific, I think is it zone 2? Is that where we're in for the aerobic, the target rate for the heart rate? You were talking about, I think the formula you used was 220 minus your age times 0.8 on the low end to times point.
On the high end.
What?
On the high end, 0.8 on the high end.
0.8 on the high end.
0.6 on the low end.
0.6 on the low.
0.6 on the low end. Yeah.
Okay. 0.6 to 0.8.
Yeah.
And what you were saying is there's another way to.
No, just there were some researchers and studies that suggest that that's not going to be as accurate for zone 2 for most people. But an easy way to think of zone 2 is when you are able to, you're exerting yourself enough that you are able to hold a conversation, but you just don't want to. It's uncomfortable enough to hold a conversation. If you wanted to, you could, but it feels uncomfortable enough that you don't want to have a conversation.
And plus, if you don't have access to a heart rate monitor, that's you can just think of it that way.
Yeah. What I often do in classes, in fact, I just had one a couple of days ago, is I have people take their own heart rate, with a stopwatch, but then, a 10-second count, and we just press in on our carotid arteries. And I feel like that's also really good because people get a little more in tune with their body that way. Because some people are like, I don't think I have one. I'm like, no, I think you do. Just press a little harder. And so it helps people kind of realize, oh, I can actually do this myself. I don't need a Fitbit or a fancy apparatus. I can just feel my own heart rate and know, oh yeah, it's twice as high as it was when we were meditating. And so that's more learning to like feel your body, how it feels differently at different stages.
There is something, I think we take it for granted because we're in medicine, being more aware of your body, but there's something to, having an awareness of your own body and, even on the internals, but being aware of your heartbeat and your breathing, that has its own calming effect, I think.
Exactly. Yeah, I think, part of this is just learning more about yourself. Like, so my feeling is like, well, it's not just the meditation or the exercise, but it's the learning in general, like learning a little bit about your own brain. And, before each class, I usually talk about something, maybe something about rumination or something about heart rate or oxygen in the blood, and, just a little bit of knowledge. And then you can apply that to your own life, to your own body and brain. And that's powerful.
Have you noticed a big change for yourself as you've been doing this training for a while now?
Yeah, definitely. I've always been a big exerciser. I've always been into aerobic exercise, particularly aerobic dancing. So that's been a part of my life that I don't need, motivation particularly to do that. But the meditation, when I was first trying to come up with an idea to build this program, and I was thinking about different types of mental training, brain games, things like that. And they all seemed kind of tedious and kind of boring. And I was talking to a friend of mine, kind of an acquaintance really. And he said, well, why don't you try meditation? And I was like, I don't know. I'm a scientist. Meditation sounds a little hooey to me. Probably not serious enough. And then I realized I didn't know what I was talking about because I'd never done it. This is nearly 20 years ago. And so I went to a Zen meditation group at the university, and I was like, wow, they're not fooling around. Like, this is serious. This is really difficult, but it's also really interesting. I found it, like, as a neuroscientist, I've been studying the brain and thinking about it almost 24/7, for most of my life, but I never listened to my own brain. I never sat in silence and listened to my own brain.
Yeah.
And I just was like, wow, how could that be? And so I just got into it, and I started like really appreciating it for the knowledge that it can bring you just by listening to your own thoughts. Come and go, and they're always changing. I mean, what better way to learn how dynamic our brain is than to listen to it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like the cobbler's kids that go without shoes, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, so definitely I've noticed a difference. It really helps me a lot. And I even use it, like today I had a little anxiety doing this podcast. So I was like, I'm going to just sit for 20 minutes and, just listen, try to settle down a bit. And I think it helps.
This podcast? No.
This one.
You're not there.
Yeah, I mean, anything that gives you like a little bit of anxiety or trepidation, you're like, I could just sit down.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there an element that learning could itself be part of the treatment? I mean, I guess there's the learning in the meditation, but as we were talking before, I was wondering, could learning itself, like learning a new language, could that be a treatment for depression? Because you're opening up these pathways, you're growing the hippocampus.
Yeah.
Is there something there or no?
Again, I think so. That's what I've been kind of mulling over, when I'm kind of thinking about this new book. I do think there's enough data, even not necessarily for depression. I mean, that might be taking it a bit too far, but certainly there's evidence that engaging in serious learning activities like learning a new language or a new instrument or new dances or, anything that really requires a lot of attention is going to change the structure of your brain. It's going to enhance all these, micro structures, cellular processes that we depend upon. And along the way, it's going to take your mind off of these negative thoughts.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Now, you have to toggle, right?
Yeah. Now, the tricky part is getting the motivation to do that. Like you could know that intellectually, like, it's good for me to not concentrate on the past or what happened or, my illnesses or, whatever it is that's troubling you. But making that transition to do something different, that's difficult. And I actually saw a study not too long ago where they actually looked at these networks that are associated with kind of effortful, what I call effortful learning, things that are effortful that require a lot of attention. And they realized that even for people to do something as simple as, not as simple, but as obvious as exercise, aerobic exercise, like people know it's good for you. They know it makes you feel better. It's not a mystery. It's not even a question anymore. But doing it is a totally different story. And, even at least according to this study, you have to, again, switch into this network that requires effort. Like you have to engage this process that inspires you to say, yeah, I'm going to do that. I'm going to learn that new language, or I'm going to go run a marathon, or even just something simple. I'm just going to go to the gym and run on a treadmill. I mean, that transition is effortful.
Yeah.
So, my feeling is you have to train your brain that it works. So for example, after every MAP training class, I have everybody just sit there for like 30 seconds. Like close your eyes and then just feel how it feels. Like feel yourself, feel how you feel, and remember how you felt before class and compare it to how you feel now.
Yeah.
And, that I think is the brain training, because then you're telling your brain, you're feeding them this information like, yeah, that's how I feel now. So next time when you're not feeling so good, or you don't want to do it, or you'd rather just sit on the couch, you'll do it.
Right.
But you have to
it lets you
train
know
your
where
brain.
you're targeted too, so that if you don't have time to do the whole thing, but you're stressed, at
Yeah.
least you know that you can get to that place, and there, you've been there. So
Yeah.
it might make it easier to find it again.
Yeah. And you can maybe just use little pieces. Maybe people
Right.
find a piece of it that helps them. They don't have to do the whole, I think sometimes people feel like, oh, if I don't, run a marathon, then I can't exercise. Or if I don't complete a whole course of MAP training, it's not going to help me. That's no.
Yeah.
Just little pieces can help us.
And as you do it, it becomes so much easier to do more of it. Right.
Yeah, once you're into it, then you're like golden, right? Then you're like, I'm here. I'm into this now.
Right.
I would
You've
imagine
got to
that-
get over that hump.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would imagine that for someone who has felt that multiple times, they can even do like a micro map. So
Yeah.
do 5-minute meditation, then do a couple of stretches, then do a couple of push-ups, let's say,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then it's not the whole thing, but it can fit in to keep yourself on track and to give yourself a bit
Yeah.
of a boost.
Right. Like a travel size.
Yeah. And I think it's important because you're activating the system I talked about earlier, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic, which is the more relaxed, slow system. You're activating both those systems together really quickly. And we do that all the time. When we breathe in, that's sympathetic. When we breathe out, that's parasympathetic.
Right.
Those systems are meant to kind of go together.
Is there a reason that you have people doing it twice a week instead of every day? Do you think every day would be better, or you think it's just too hard to, it's too much of a commitment?
I think I wanted it to be practical.
Yeah.
Because like I said a minute ago, people think, oh, I have to do this every day now, or it's not going to work. And so like really what is the minimum
Right.
is what I would wanted to know. So we mostly did twice a week in most of our studies, but some of the studies we did basically once a week. And then people could do it on their own. So, who knows how well that went. And it still had pretty positive effects. So I think this idea that you have to do something, commit yourself to inordinate amounts of time, or, spend a lot of money, or it's just not true.
Right.
You can do these like short little experiences can have really dramatic changes on your well-being.
Yeah. But presumably more is better, but but
Yeah.
don't let good be the enemy of, or perfect. be-
Exactly. Like I know people that do it every day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Not me. And I'm like the biggest proponent, but I don't do it every day because I don't know, I have other things to do, but I
Right.
feel like once or twice a week is fine.
Well, one of the important things that I think we mentioned before, but I think it pays to mention again, is the value and benefit of this training, because we were just talking right now about the more immediate response, right? The more immediate centering, the more immediate good response, how well we feel. But the one thing that you mentioned in the book, which I think is great, is that it provides you with resilience. It builds resilience, and you actually create that resilience for what is inevitably going to happen, because we all agreed in the beginning of this conversation that probably the worst things that will happen in our lives have not yet happened.
Hey.
Yeah.
Hey.
But and knowing that if you need that resilience through this training, it's not just about making yourself feel better now, but you're inoculating yourself from creating
Yeah.
that traumatic experience that will stay with you. And then that's great.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much like building up your body so that when you have to go lift heavy things, you're more ready for that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I talk about the study we did, and, who would have predicted the pandemic? So I was, doing all these studies. In fact, we were going to go into the clinic and do some MAP training with psychosis, actually. And the pandemic hit, and everything kind of shut down. And I was like, wow, this is traumatic, right? People are dying. We don't have a vaccine. Everyone's at home. I don't have to tell anyone on the whole planet. It was so traumatic. And so with one of my graduate students, I was like, well, we should do something during this experience. And her mother was a teacher in the New York City schools, and said, they're under a lot of stress, the teachers, because the kids are, sick. They don't know if they're going back to school. They don't know if they're going to bring it home to their families. Again, there's just so many stressors during that time. So we gave it to a bunch of teachers during that summer, the summer of 2020, the first summer of the pandemic. And it helped the teachers who did it compared to teachers who didn't. But the best data from that was that the teachers, I mean, sadly, as the summer progressed, the teachers who didn't do it became more and more and more stressed. They became more stressed. They became more anxious. They started ruminating more. They had a lot more symptoms as the summer progressed, because they thought they'd have to go back to school or teach online. But the ones who were doing the training didn't. They didn't get worse, and if anything, they actually got better. So that was a great indication, right, that it prevented the trauma that was to come.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
it
I
really
was
seems
really-
like a great way to, I mean, what a
It
great
prevents-
service to
we-
also,
Yeah,
yeah.
because we didn't know what was going to happen, so it was a way of preventing the future symptoms that would have arose had these people not done it.
Yeah, this really seems like the kind of training that needs to get out to the public in a big way,
I
because
know.
it's there's no medicine, it's free, you can do
It's
it at
free.
home, it's all of that,
I know.
and it's proven to work, which is also a lot more than you can say about most of these kinds of interventions that have been tried in the past, right?
I know.
Studies to validate it.
I know, I'm trying,
Right.
that's what I mean. I'm not even I'm not interested in making money or becoming famous or anything like that. I just want people to do it.
All we're
Because
asking for is a Nobel Prize. That's it.
and maybe that.
Maybe if it's some springboard to that, then there's no telling.
But it's I don't want to say it's easy, because it's not easy to do, because most
not,
things
yeah.
in life that are good for us are not easy. People want to take a pill or do something like super easy. No, but you have to put some effort into it.
Yes.
But it actually works. We did a study, we just finished a study with women who had sexual trauma. So they had a lot of sexual violence. They did it twice a week for 6 weeks. All of them had PTSD at the beginning. At the end, less than half were diagnosed with PTSD. They had 40% less symptoms. I mean, it's
Yeah, incredible.
it's amazing.
Yeah, that is really remarkable.
Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, it's not, the cool thing about the last thing I wanted to mention about this is it's really cool because it's really good for the long term, but also you do get instant gratification because you feel really good
Yeah.
at the end of it. So it's not like, some things you really don't feel, you're doing it banking that this is good for me. I guess I'm doing it because it's good. But here, you really feel better at the end of it. I mean, for me, it was really hard to meditate. And I think probably the harder it is for you to sit down and meditate, probably the more you need it.
Yeah.
Right? Because, you get, for those of us, I'll say, whose minds are just going off in different places, no, that's why, this is why it's even more important to do
Yeah.
it. But when you get through it, you feel a peace that is, not usually that easily accessible. So
Yeah, and I definitely have to thank you personally, because after reading your book, I got back into meditation. I have stopped meditating for a good 2 years at least, and I've just been exercising in the morning. But reading your book and the research you present and the benefits of combining meditation with exercise, just so profound and mind-blowing that, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you for saying that. That makes my day because yeah, that's what I want. I want people to not only like learn about it, but then do it. Because once you do it, I use this quote, this friend of mine, he's a Zen monk actually. And he has a saying, the only good kind of meditation is the kind you do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I kind of stole it from him. And I said, the only good kind of map training is the kind you do.
Right. Right.
Because you can read about it and learn about it, whatever.
Yeah.
But until you do it, you can't understand. Like I love that you said a peace, a sense of peace that you felt after doing it. And that I would agree with that. It's like a sense of peace.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the people that do it, I think you become your, sort of a emissary for it because it feels good and you want other people to have that feeling.
Yeah,
too.
exactly.
All right. So you've been so gracious and so generous with your time. Thank you so much for walking us through all of this. I hope that people, I'm sure they will, they'll pick up the book and they'll start doing the map training and maybe that's what we need to get this world back righted is people.
It definitely won't hurt.
Yeah, definitely. We'll get all of our political leaders doing some map training. Maybe
definitely.
Thank you so much.
Definitely.
We really appreciate it.
Thank you. I had such a great time.
Friends, thank you for your attention. We hope you've enjoyed the conversation. If you find value, please remember to hit the like button and help us with our YouTube algorithm. Consider subscribing to the channel and turn on the notifications so you can stay up to date with everything going on with the channel. And please leave us a comment, let us know what you thought about this show and also what you'd like to hear about in the future.